The operative had been living in Tehran for 11 months under a name that was not his own, in an apartment that belonged to a legend, a carefully constructed fiction of identity, backstory, and documentation so complete that it had its own history, its own tax records, its own memories. He spoke Farsi without an accent. He knew the neighborhood's coffee shops, knew which vendor near the bazaar sold the best pistachios, knew which streets to avoid on Friday afternoons when the Revolutionary Guard conducted their routine patrols. He was not there to kill anyone. Not directly. He was there to watch. To map. To transmit. His target was a building, a specific building in a specific district of Tehran, unremarkable from the outside, the kind of structure that disappears into a city's texture if you are not looking for it. Inside that building, according to the intelligence that had sent him here, was something that Israel could not allow to exist undisturbed. He did not know all the details. In his profession, you rarely did. You knew your piece. Someone else knew theirs. Somewhere above both of them, in a room in Tel Aviv that most Israelis would never see, someone held all the pieces together and decided what to do with them. This is how the secret war works. Not in explosions, or not only in explosions. Mostly in patience. In the slow, grinding accumulation of intelligence that makes the precise action possible. In the human beings who volunteer, or are recruited, or are coerced, into carrying the war forward one careful step at a time. This is the story of that war. The Mossad's secret campaign against Iran, the longest, deepest, most consequential covert operation in the history of the modern Middle East. Act 1. The Institute, what Mossad is and is not. The Mossad, HaMossad Lemodian Yultafkadim Mewadim, the Institute for Intelligence and Special Operations, was formally established in 1949, 1 year after the founding of the State of Israel. It was built by a country that had learned, in the most devastating possible terms, what it meant to exist without the means of self-defense. Its founding mandate was existential. Never again would the Jewish people be taken by surprise. Never again would the machinery of destruction move without warning. The Mossad would watch. It would know. And when knowledge was not enough, it would act. From its earliest years, the organization attracted men and women shaped by the particular psychology that the 20th century had imposed on Israeli Jews, people who had lost families in the Holocaust, who had fought in Israel's War of Independence, who understood that the distance between survival and annihilation was not a matter of geography or politics but of intelligence, preparation, and the willingness to do what needed to be done before the moment of crisis arrived. The Mossad is not the CIA. It is smaller. Estimates of its personnel run between 7,000 and 10,000, compared to the CIA's estimated 21,000. It does not have the CIA's budget, its global network of stations, its institutional relationship with the full apparatus of a superpower. What it has, by virtually every external assessment, is a quality of operational tradecraft, of the human intelligence work, the running of agents, the planning and execution of clandestine operations, that is unmatched anywhere in the world. Its relationship with Iran is as old as the Islamic Republic itself. When the Shah fell in 1979 and the new government made its hostility to Israel unmistakably clear, the Mossad began the process of understanding the new adversary, mapping its intelligence services, its military structure, its decision-making hierarchy, its nuclear ambitions. This was not a sudden pivot. It was the slow, methodical construction of a target picture that would take decades to complete, and that, in important ways, is still being completed today. What drives the Mossad's Iran campaign is not hatred. At the operational level, emotion is a liability. What drives it is a calculation that an Iran capable of developing nuclear weapons, combined with an Iran that has openly declared its intention to eliminate the State of Israel, represents an existential threat that cannot be deterred by conventional means alone. That the tools of covert action, penetration, sabotage, assassination, are not alternatives to diplomacy or military force, but complements to them. That the intelligence gathered through patient, dangerous human work is the foundation on which everything else rests. The men and women who carry out this work do so largely in anonymity. Their names, when they are known at all, are usually known because something went wrong. The successes are classified. The failures make headlines. This asymmetry shapes everything about how the organization is understood from the outside, and it is worth holding in mind as we trace the operations that have defined Israel's secret war against Iran. Act 2: The Scientists, a campaign of targeted elimination. The decision to target Iranian nuclear scientists was not made lightly. It represented a crossing of a line that democratic states are reluctant to cross openly, the deliberate killing of individuals who are not soldiers, who are not carrying weapons, who are going about what might, in any other context, be described as professional work. But the Israeli government's calculation was explicit, if never publicly stated. Iran's nuclear scientists were not civilians in any meaningful strategic sense. They were the intellectual infrastructure of a weapons program. Killing them would not destroy the program. Knowledge, once acquired, cannot be uninvented, but it would slow it. It would create vacuums of expertise that would take years to fill. It would force the program's leadership to spend resources on security rather than enrichment. And it would send a message, to Iran, to the scientists themselves, to anyone who might consider joining the program, that participation in Iran's nuclear development carried a personal cost. The first killing attributed to Israeli intelligence in the context of the nuclear program occurred in January 2010. Mossad Ali Mohammadi, a nuclear physicist at the University of Tehran, was killed by a remote-controlled bomb attached to a motorcycle parked outside his home. Iranian authorities initially attempted to blame internal opposition groups. The attribution to Israel, while never officially confirmed, became the working assumption of virtually every intelligence service that examined the operation. What followed was a campaign of extraordinary precision and audacity. In November 2010, two simultaneous attacks in Tehran killed Majid Shahriari, a senior nuclear engineer, and wounded Faridun Abbasi-Davani, a scientist who would later become the head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization. The attacks used the same method, magnetic bombs, attached to moving vehicles by operatives on motorcycles in morning traffic. The sophistication required, the surveillance, the timing, the ability to operate in coordinated pairs in a city under intense security, left analysts struggling to identify a plausible alternative to Israeli intelligence. The air in Tehran that winter carried a particular tension. Security services doubled their patrols around known nuclear facilities and the residences of senior scientists. Scientists began varying their routes to work, changing departure times, requesting armed escorts. Some, according to later accounts, began sleeping in different locations. The fear was real and it was rational, and it was, from the Israeli perspective, part of the point. In July 2011, Dariush Rezaianjad was shot and killed outside his daughter's kindergarten in Tehran. He was described by Iranian officials as an electrical engineer with no connection to the nuclear program. Western intelligence assessments disagreed. In January 2012, Mostafa Ahmadi Roshan, a director at the Natanz uranium enrichment facility, was killed by another magnetic bomb on his car. He was 32 years old. He left behind a wife and a young son. These are not abstractions. These are human lives, ended by decisions made in conference rooms in Tel Aviv by people who had assessed the strategic calculus and concluded that the math justified the action. The judgment of history on these decisions is not settled. It depends, in large part, on how one weighs the prevention of a potential future catastrophe against the certain, immediate cost of individual human lives. What is beyond dispute is that the campaign happened, that it was effective in measurable ways, and that it established a precedent for the use of targeted killing as a tool of nuclear nonproliferation that has reshaped the strategic landscape. Iran struck back, or tried to. In 2012, Iranian intelligence was linked to attacks or attempted attacks on Israeli diplomats and citizens in Georgia, India, Thailand, Azerbaijan, Kenya, and Cyprus. Most of the attacks failed, due to operational security failures by the Iranian operatives involved. One attack, in New Delhi, wounded an Israeli diplomat's wife. The attempted attacks were clumsy compared to the Israeli operations, a fact that Iranian intelligence services, stung by the comparison, were reportedly determined to remedy. The exchange established the terms of a covert war that would escalate, rather than resolve, over the following decade. Each side was watching the other. Each side was learning from what it watched. And each side was calculating, constantly, obsessively, the threshold between acceptable escalation and the act that would trigger something neither side could control. Act 3, Stuxnet, the first cyber weapon. In 2007, something began going wrong at the Natanz uranium enrichment facility in central Iran. The centrifuges, advanced machines spinning at 50,000 revolutions per minute to separate uranium isotopes, were failing at an unusual rate. The engineers responsible for them could find no explanation. The machines reported normal operation to their control systems. The physical reality was destruction. The smell of burning electrical components. The sound of metal stressed beyond tolerance. The sight of cascades of centrifuges that had cost Iran years of development and millions of dollars reduced to scrap. And no one inside Iran's nuclear program could explain why. The answer was Stuxnet, a piece of malicious software so sophisticated, so precisely targeted, and so operationally novel that when it was finally discovered and analyzed by independent cybersecurity researchers in 2010, it was described by some of the world's leading experts as a fundamental transformation in the nature of warfare. Not since the development of nuclear weapons had a single technology so completely altered what was strategically possible. Stuxnet targeted one specific piece of hardware, the Siemens programmable logic controllers used to manage centrifuge speeds at Natanz. It identified those controllers, altered the commands they sent to the centrifuges, causing them to spin at destructive speeds, and simultaneously reported normal operation to the monitoring systems. It was a lie embedded in a machine, a deception so complete that the people responsible for the centrifuges could not trust their own instruments. The worm had been introduced into the facility through infected USB drives, almost certainly carried in by Iranian engineers who had no idea what they were transporting. This required a level of intelligence penetration, an understanding of the specific supply chains, the specific personnel, the specific equipment in use, that could only have come from deep human sources inside Iran's nuclear program. Stuxnet was not just a cyber weapon. It was the product of an intelligence operation of extraordinary depth. By the time it was discovered, Stuxnet had destroyed approximately 1,000 centrifuges, roughly 20% of Iran's enrichment capacity, and set the program back by an estimated 2 years. It had also, as a side effect, escaped beyond Natanz and infected computers in dozens of countries, which is how it eventually came to the attention of researchers who had no idea what they were looking at. The analysis that followed, conducted by teams at Kaspersky Lab, Symantec, and other security firms, revealed a weapon of such complexity that it contained multiple zero-day exploits, an unprecedented number, each one representing months of development and a valuable intelligence asset expended in a single operation. The United States and Israel have never officially acknowledged responsibility for Stuxnet. Reporting by the New York Times and subsequent investigative journalism established the operation, codenamed Olympic Games, as a joint American-Israeli project initiated under the George W. Bush administration and continued under Barack Obama. The operation had been authorized at the highest levels of both governments. It had been designed specifically to delay Iran's nuclear program long enough for diplomacy to work, or for the program to be stopped by other means. Diplomacy did not work quickly enough. The program was not stopped. And Stuxnet, while it demonstrated the extraordinary reach of Israeli and American intelligence inside Iran's most sensitive facilities, also demonstrated something that its architects had perhaps not fully anticipated, that the line between cyber espionage and cyber warfare had been crossed, that the precedent was now set, and that Iran, studying the weapon that had been used against it with the specific, focused attention of a student learning from a master, would eventually develop cyber capabilities of its own. The lesson of Stuxnet cut in both directions. It proved what was possible. It also taught the adversary how. Act 4, The Atomic Archive, the greatest intelligence heist in history. On the night of January 31, 2018, a team of Mossad operatives entered a nondescript warehouse in the Shourabad district of Tehran. They bypassed the security system, which was sophisticated, but not sophisticated enough, and spent 6 hours removing the contents of 32 safes. They took 111 compact discs. They took approximately 50,000 pages of documents. They loaded the material into vehicles and drove it out of Iran. What they had taken was Iran's nuclear archive, the complete documented record of Project Ahmad, Iran's covert nuclear weapons development program, which had officially been shut down in 2003 following international pressure but which, the archive revealed, had continued in various forms, with its knowledge carefully preserved and organized against the day when circumstances might allow it to resume. The operation, which Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu revealed publicly in April 2018, in a televised presentation that showed photographs of the actual documents, was described by intelligence professionals across multiple countries as the most significant intelligence coup in decades. The scale of the logistical achievement alone was staggering. The documents weighed approximately half a ton. They had been stored in a facility that Iran believed was secure. Identifying the location, penetrating the security, extracting the material, and getting it out of the country, all without triggering an alert, required an operation of such precision and depth that many experienced analysts initially refused to believe it had happened as described. It had happened exactly as described. The archive revealed, in Iran's own words and Iran's own handwriting, the structure and progress of its nuclear weapons program, the warhead designs, the delivery system development, the plans for testing that had been prepared and then shelved, the names of the scientists and engineers involved, the organizational chart of a program that Iran had publicly denied ever existed. It was, in Netanyahu's phrase, a treasure trove. It was also a weapon, not a military weapon, but a diplomatic one, providing concrete evidence for the American decision to withdraw from the JCPOA and reimpose sanctions, and demonstrating to the international community the gap between Iran's official declarations and the reality that its own documents recorded. For Iran's intelligence services, the Shourabad operation was a catastrophe of the first order. Not primarily because of what was taken. The knowledge in the archive was already known to Iran's scientists, who did not need documents to remember what they had done. The catastrophe was what the operation revealed about the depth of Israeli penetration. Someone had known the archive existed. Someone had known where it was. Someone had known the security arrangements. The counterintelligence investigation that followed, intense, thorough, and by later accounts, deeply damaging to Iran's intelligence apparatus, could not definitively identify the source or sources. Which meant the sources were still there. The shadow of that uncertainty, the knowledge that the adversary knows things it should not know, that somewhere in your organization trust has been broken in a way you cannot locate, is one of the most corrosive forces in any intelligence service. It produces paralysis, suspicion, the inability to act decisively because you cannot be certain who is watching. It was, in its way, as damaging as any kinetic operation the Mossad had conducted against Iran's nuclear program. Act 5 Fakhrizadeh, The End of the Father. His name had appeared in intelligence reports for 20 years. Western analysts had tracked his career through Iran's nuclear establishment with the particular attention reserved for individuals who seemed to be at the center of something important. The International Atomic Energy Agency had named him in reports as a person of interest. President George W. Bush had been briefed on him. So had Obama. So had Trump. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was, by the assessment of multiple Western intelligence agencies, the man most responsible for the scientific and organizational development of Iran's nuclear weapons capability. He was the head of the Organization of Defensive Innovation and Research, SBND, in its Farsi acronym, a body that Iranian officials insisted was focused on defensive technologies and that Western intelligence concluded was the institutional heir to Project Ahmad. He was, in the phrase that intelligence officials used when they were being direct, the father of the Iranian bomb. On November 27, 2020, Fakhrizadeh was traveling with his wife and a security escort on a highway near the town of Absard, east of Tehran. An ambush had been prepared. It involved a 1-ton Nissan pickup truck, parked on the side of the road, loaded with explosives and a remotely operated machine gun. The truck was detonated as the convoy passed. The machine gun, reportedly controlled via satellite link by operators who were not physically present at the scene, fired at Fakhrizadeh's car with a precision that the subsequent investigation found almost unbelievable. It fired 113 rounds. It hit Fakhrizadeh multiple times. It did not hit his wife, who was sitting beside him. The targeting selectivity, the ability to distinguish, through a remote camera and a processing system, between the primary target and a civilian sitting inches away, represented a level of technological sophistication in a field assassination that had no precedent. Iranian investigators, examining the scene in the days after, struggled to fully reconstruct what had happened. Reports emerged that the weapon had used artificial intelligence to compensate for the satellite signal delay, that the system had been smart enough to lead the target, to adjust for the time between command and action, to hit a moving human being with a degree of accuracy that a human sniper at that range would have found difficult. Fakhrizadeh died in hospital shortly after the attack. His wife was unharmed. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei publicly promised that definitive punishment would be delivered to those responsible. Iran's intelligence services launched an investigation that reportedly consumed enormous resources. The Revolutionary Guard placed its forces on heightened alert. Diplomatic communications between Tehran and European capitals, the Europeans were, at the time, trying to preserve the remnants of the JCPOA, were consumed, for weeks, by the fallout. But the deeper damage was not diplomatic. It was psychological. The killing of Fakhrizadeh, a man who had been, by all accounts, extremely security conscious, who varied his routes, who traveled with armed protection, who lived under the assumption that he was a target, demonstrated to every senior figure in Iran's nuclear and military establishment that no security arrangement was adequate against an adversary with this level of intelligence penetration and this level of technological capability. The message was not addressed to Fakhrizadeh. He was dead. The message was addressed to everyone who knew who he was and what he had done. And everyone in that world knew exactly what the message said. Act 6. The Human Sources. The War Inside the War. Every covert operation described in this documentary rested on the same foundation: human intelligence. The Stuxnet worm required someone to know the specific equipment at Natanz. The archive heist required someone to know the warehouse in Shahrabad. The assassination of Fakhrizadeh required someone to know his route, his schedule, his security arrangements. The Mossad's recruitment and management of human sources inside Iran is the most closely guarded secret in Israeli intelligence, more closely guarded than the operations themselves, because sources, unlike completed operations, are still active. They are still inside. They are still at risk. What can be said based on the operations that have become public and the counterintelligence actions that Iran has taken in response is that the Mossad has achieved a level of penetration inside Iran's military and intelligence establishment that is, by historical standards, remarkable. Iran has, over the past 2 decades, arrested and executed dozens of individuals it identified as Israeli agents, a number that represents both the scale of the penetration and the cost it has extracted from the individuals involved. The people who become agents inside a hostile state do so for reasons that are as varied as human motivation itself. Some are motivated by ideology, Iranians who oppose the Islamic Republic and see cooperation with Israel as a form of resistance. Some are motivated by money, the Mossad's financial resources, by the standards of the individuals it recruits, are substantial. Some are motivated by coercion, caught in compromising situations and offered a choice between cooperation and exposure. Some, perhaps the most valuable, are motivated by a combination: genuine conviction reinforced by material benefit, the psychology of the true believer who has also found that belief pays. What unites them, regardless of motivation, is the specific experience of operating inside a system that is trying to find them, of carrying a secret that, if discovered, means death, and carrying it for months or years while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. The psychological literature on long-term covert agents describes a kind of double consciousness, the ability to be, simultaneously, the person you are presenting and the person you actually are, to shift between identities so fluidly that the seam between them becomes invisible even to yourself. Some agents are discovered. Iran has shown remarkable willingness to publicize these discoveries, parading captured agents on state television, conducting trials, carrying out executions in ways designed to serve as deterrents. In 2019, Iran announced it had dismantled the Mossad network and executed several individuals. In 2021, it announced the arrest of an individual it described as a Mossad agent who had been involved in intelligence collection related to the nuclear program. The announcements are, in part, propaganda, designed to demonstrate the competence of Iran's counterintelligence services and to intimidate potential recruits. But the arrests are real, and the executions are real, and the people who die in those circumstances are people who made a choice, for whatever reasons, and paid for it with everything. This is the dimension of covert operations that gets lost in the strategic accounting, the human cost on all sides. The operatives who go in and sometimes don't come out. The agents who are discovered and executed. The families on both sides who are told, in different ways and with different degrees of honesty, that someone they loved died in service of something larger. Act 7, Operation Rising Sun, Strikes in the Shadows. The Mossad's campaign against Iran is not conducted only through assassination and espionage. It also operates, in close coordination with the Israeli Air Force and military intelligence, through a sustained campaign of physical sabotage against Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. In July 2020, a fire broke out at the Natanz nuclear facility, specifically in a building that Western analysts identified as an advanced centrifuge assembly facility. The damage was substantial, setting back Iran's capacity to deploy the more advanced IR-4 and IR-6 centrifuges by what analysts estimated as over a year. Iranian officials initially described the incident as an accident. They subsequently acknowledged it as sabotage. No state claimed responsibility. 2 months later, in September 2020, an explosion damaged the Zargan power plant near the city of Awaz. In October, another incident at Natanz. In April 2021, a power outage struck Natanz precisely as Iran was preparing to demonstrate its advanced enrichment capacity to international media, an outage that Iran's intelligence minister described as nuclear terrorism and attributed to Israel. The attack destroyed or damaged approximately 1,000 centrifuges, according to Iranian officials. These incidents form a pattern that is, by now, familiar to anyone following the conflict, a sustained, systematic effort to impose physical costs on Iran's nuclear program through operations that are deniable, that fall short of the threshold for open military action, and that are designed to be cumulative rather than decisive. No single act of sabotage stops Iran's nuclear program. Together, they impose a continuous friction, a constant diversion of resources toward repair and reconstruction, a constant anxiety about the next incident, a constant degradation of the program's pace and confidence. Iran has responded to this campaign not only with counterintelligence operations but with physical security investments of extraordinary scale. Natanz has been progressively buried deeper underground. New centrifuge halls have been constructed at depths that Israeli conventional munitions cannot reliably penetrate. Security around nuclear facilities has been dramatically enhanced. The program has been dispersed, with activities spread across multiple facilities to reduce the impact of any single attack. This dispersal creates its own intelligence problem for Israel, more targets, distributed across a larger geography, requiring more intelligence assets to monitor. The action-reaction dynamic: Israel attacks, Iran hardens, Israel must work harder to penetrate the hardened target, is a spiral that has no obvious terminal point. Each cycle produces a more resilient Iranian program and a more stretched Israeli intelligence effort. This is not a war that either side is winning in any conventional sense. It is a war of attrition against an adversary's capability, conducted with the knowledge that the capability, however damaged, continues to exist and continues to develop. Act 8. The Limits of the Secret War. The question that Israeli strategists, American analysts, and independent experts have been wrestling with for decades is a simple one: is it working? The answer is complicated in ways that resist the simple narratives that covert operations tend to generate. On one hand, the Mossad's campaign against Iran's nuclear program has demonstrably slowed that program. The centrifuge destructions, the assassinations, the archive heist, the cyber operations, each of these has imposed real costs and real delays. Without them, Iran's nuclear program would, by most analytical assessments, be further along than it is. On the other hand, Iran's nuclear program is further along than it has ever been. Iran is enriching uranium to 60% purity. It has a stockpile of enriched uranium that would require only weeks of additional processing to reach weapons grade. It has ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. The program that Israel has been targeting for 2 decades has not been stopped. It has been slowed, harassed, and made more expensive. It has not been ended. The question of whether a covert campaign can substitute for, or must eventually be accompanied by, military action against Iran's nuclear facilities is the most consequential strategic question in the Middle East, and it has no clean answer. Military action against Iran's dispersed, hardened, buried nuclear infrastructure would be enormously difficult and enormously costly, in Iranian civilian casualties, in regional escalation, in the global economic consequences of a major war in the Persian Gulf. It might not even succeed in destroying the program, given how deeply it has been buried and dispersed. It would almost certainly accelerate Iran's determination to acquire nuclear weapons. The covert campaign is, in this sense, the least bad option among options that are all bad. It buys time. It creates leverage. It demonstrates capability and will in ways that affect Iranian decision-making. But it does not resolve the underlying problem, and the underlying problem, and Iran with the technology, the knowledge, and the motivation to build a nuclear weapon, is not the kind of problem that resolves through covert action alone. What it requires, ultimately, is political change, either a diplomatic agreement that genuinely constrains Iran's program with verification mechanisms strong enough to be believed, or a transformation of the Iranian political system itself. Neither of these is achievable through intelligence operations. They are achievable only through the kind of sustained, patient, often frustrating political engagement that covert action, by its nature, tends to bypass. The Mossad knows this. Its directors, in the classified assessments that occasionally surface in leaks and in the memoirs of retired officials, have been remarkably consistent in insisting that the covert campaign is a tool, not a strategy, that it creates conditions, not outcomes. The outcomes depend on decisions made in the open, by governments that must ultimately account to their populations for the choices they make. That is a harder war. And it is one that is still being fought. Epilogue: The Watchers and the Watched. Somewhere in Tehran, the counterintelligence investigation continues. It has been running, in various forms, for years, trying to find the sources, to map the networks, to understand how so much that was supposed to be secret became known. It has found some of them. It has not found all of them. Somewhere in Tel Aviv, in the building that does not appear on tourist maps, in the offices where the decisions are made, the next operation is being planned. The intelligence picture is being updated. The target set is being refined. The question of how to impose the next cost, the next delay, the next demonstration of reach and capability, is being worked through by people who have spent their careers in the geography between certainty and catastrophe. The secret war has no official start date and no projected end. It began when the Islamic Republic decided, in 1979, that Israel was an enemy that could not be accepted. It will not end until that political reality changes, until Iran and Israel find some accommodation, however cold and uncomfortable, with each other's existence. The covert operations, the assassinations, the cyber weapons, the archive heists, these are not the cause of the conflict, and they are not the solution to it. They are the management of it, conducted at enormous cost and extraordinary risk by people who understand, better than almost anyone, that management is not resolution. The man who spent 11 months in Tehran, watching a building, transmitting intelligence that he did not fully understand to people he would never meet, he came home eventually, under arrangements that are not part of the public record. He resumed a life that looked, from the outside, like the life he had lived before. It was not. It never is. The building he watched was struck 6 months after he left. A precise, contained explosion. Minimal visible damage from the outside. Inside, by the assessment of the analysts who examined the satellite imagery, a specific capability had been degraded in a specific way. By how much, and for how long, and what Iran did to compensate, these are questions that the next chapter of the secret war is in the process of answering. The war goes on. In the dark, in the electromagnetic spectrum, in the space between two countries that cannot find a way to stop, the watchers watch, the planners plan, and the intelligence flows, invisible, through the circuits of a conflict that has no end in sight. But somewhere in the architecture of this war, in the discipline required to sustain it, in the restraint that has, so far, kept it from becoming something larger, there is also a kind of evidence that two states, however hostile, can recognize the line between manageable enmity and mutual annihilation, and choose, repeatedly, not to cross it. Whether that choice will hold, whether the calculations will remain stable as Iran approaches the nuclear threshold and Israel contemplates its options, is the question on which everything depends. The files are not closed. They are open, active, and growing. And the next entry is being written tonight.